The silence had structure. That was what disturbed them most. Not the absence of the warp's whisper, but the presence of something that actively denied it. In the charted sectors of Imperium Nihilus, where the Astronomican's light had never returned since the Great Rift's opening, such phenomena were catalogued and categorized. Warp storms came and went. Demonic manifestations flared like solar prominences before collapsing back into the immaterium's churning depths. Navigator houses maintained their roots through careful observation of these patterns, reading the tides of unreality as their ancestors had done for 10,000 years. But this was different. Astropath Secundus Marin had served aboard the Eternal Vigilance for 43 years. She had weathered the psychic screams of dying worlds, felt the warp's claws rake across her consciousness during failed Geller field transitions, endured the background radiation of chaos that permeated Nihilus like radiation from a dying star. Her mind bore the scars of service neural pathways calcified by decades of exposure to humanity's collective psychic presence. Yet when her consciousness touched the phenomenon spreading through subsector Valdris, she found nothing. No emotion, no whisper, no psychic echo of life or death or anything between. The warp did not rage here. It simply ceased to function as the warp should. Ships attempting to translate into the Imperium reported their navigators collapsing, overwhelmed not by visions, but by their sudden absence. Geller fields activated normally, then found nothing to ward against. Astropathic choirs sent messages into the void and received only their own transmissions, reflected back, distorted by passage through something that rejected psychic energy, the way a mirror rejects light. The Ordo Hereticus had a classification for such events. Null zones. Pariah phenomenon. The touch of Necron technology, perhaps, or the influence of the Sisters of Silence operating beyond their mandate. But this encompassed entire star systems, hive worlds that should have collapsed into madness and cannibalism within months of the Astronomican's failure continued to function. Production quotas were met. Tithes were paid. Planetary governors submitted reports of unusual stability, their missives transmitted by conventional astropathic means that somehow found purchase in realms where the warp had been systematically excluded. Lord Inquisitor Viskellen reviewed the data with growing unease. 40 worlds, 12 systems, a spreading sphere of impossible peace in a region where chaos should reign supreme. His augmetic eye processed the tactical overlays, while his biological one traced the expanding boundary on the hololith projector. The phenomenon was growing, slowly, methodically, like an infection spreading through tissue. But infections caused decay. This brought order. He had served the Inquisition for 90 years. He had seen horrors that would shatter mortal minds, witnessed the Imperium's darkest truths, learned to recognize the patterns of corruption in all their varied forms. This pattern was new. And in a galaxy where everything familiar led inevitably to damnation, the unfamiliar represented the most dangerous threat of all. The Lord Inquisitor activated his secure Vox channel and spoke 3 words that would reshape the balance of power in Imperium Nihilus. Prepare for deployment. The ultramarine strike cruiser Macragy's Honor translated into real space at the outer edge of System Valdris 7 with weapons already primed. Their sensors had detected the phenomenon 3 weeks prior during a routine patrol sweep. A star system functioning within acceptable imperial parameters, despite being cut off from the Astronomican for 17 years. The impossibility of this troubled Captain Ventress more than any demonic incursion would have. Demons, he understood. Corruption followed predictable patterns. Heresy announced itself through familiar signs. This was different. His tactical cogitators displayed population centers maintaining production quotas. Vox traffic indicated normal commerce between hab blocks. Most disturbing were the astropathic readings, or rather their absence. The entire system existed in a bubble where the warp simply ceased to function as it should. The first landing parties touched down on Valdris Prime 18 hours later. Sergeant Theron led Second Squad through the primary hive's commercial district, their bolters tracking potential threats with practiced discipline. Citizens moved through their daily routines with an efficiency that bordered on the unnatural. No cult symbols marked the walls. No whispering voices emanated from the ventilation shafts. Children played in designated recreational zones, while their parents queued for ration distribution without the usual complaints or attempts at bribery. "This feels wrong," veteran brother Cassius voxed over the squad channel. "It's too quiet." Theron understood what he meant. Not an absence of sound, but an absence of the background radiation of human misery that permeated every hive world he had ever visited. No gang violence echoed from the underhive. No cult uprisings required suppression. The local Arbites reported crime rates that would have been enviable on Holy Terra itself. The interrogation of planetary officials provided no clarity. Governor Marin answered their questions with transparent honesty that further deepened the mystery. Yes, they had noticed the Astronomican's failure. Yes, they had prepared for the inevitable collapse into anarchy. But the collapse never came. Chaos cults that had been festering in the underhive simply ceased their activities. Demonic manifestations that typically erupted during psychic stress events failed to materialize. Even the most corrupted sectors showed signs of gradual stabilization rather than accelerating decay. Captain Ventris reviewed the accumulated data with growing unease. 17 years of self-sufficiency in a region where most worlds collapsed within months. Production figures that exceeded pre-rift averages. Social stability metrics that suggested outside intervention of a scale and sophistication beyond anything the Imperium itself could achieve. Yet their most thorough searches revealed no Xenos technology, no forbidden archaeotech, no signs of the mechanisms that would be required to produce these results. Then the entity appeared. It manifested not with a dramatic flourish of demonic summoning, or the violent teleportation of Xenos technology, but simply stepped into existence at the center of the planetary governor's audience chamber. One moment the space was empty, the next it contained a figure that looked almost human. Almost. Ventris had fought across the galaxy for 2 centuries. He recognized the subtle wrongness of proportions that marked something operating outside the Imperium's established parameters. The entity studied them with eyes of an unsettling blue clarity. When it spoke, its voice carried none of the distortion that marked warp entities, yet seemed to bypass Vox systems entirely and speak directly to their enhanced hearing. "I am Rimuru Tempest. I've been expecting contact with Imperial authorities for some time now." Brother Tagurius, the chief librarian, who had accompanied the expedition, immediately attempted psychic probing. His consciousness touched the entity and recoiled not from corruption, but from complete illegibility. The creature registered as neither human nor Xenos in the categorizations that had served the Imperium for 10 millennia. More troubling still, it seemed to exist in a state that actively rejected psychic examination, while displaying no signs of being a blank or pariah. "What are you?" Ventris demanded, his hand resting on his bolt pistol's grip. The entity calling itself Rimuru tilted its head in a gesture that might have been curiosity or amusement. "That's a complicated question. What I am matters less than what I offer. These 17 systems are stable. Crime has decreased by 78%. Demonic manifestations have dropped to 0. Your citizens are safer here than they have been in 3 centuries. Heresy often wears the mask of improvement, Tigurius interjected. The ruinous powers promise much before exacting their price. I'm not offering promises, Rimuru replied. I'm presenting observable results. Your own data confirms what I'm telling you. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Robut Guilliman himself. The Lord Regent had been conducting operations 3 systems away when news of the phenomenon reached him. He entered the audience chamber with the measured stride of someone who had rebuilt empires and shattered civilizations, his armor of fate humming with barely contained power. Rimuru turned to face him with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than the fear or worship that typically greeted a Primarch's presence. This alone marked it as either supremely confident or dangerously ignorant. Guilliman studied the entity in silence for a long moment. His tactical genius processed possibilities faster than even the most advanced cogitators. This thing had achieved what the Imperium considered impossible. It represented either humanity's salvation or a threat more insidious than chaos itself, precisely because it operated through mechanisms the Imperium could neither understand nor counter. Lord Guilliman, Rimuru said with a slight bow that managed to convey respect without submission. I was hoping we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. The Primarch's response came with the weight of absolute authority. We will discuss many things, beginning with the nature of your existence and ending with the question of whether you will be permitted to continue it. Rimuru's expression showed neither fear nor defiance. I expected nothing less. Shall we begin? The silence that followed carried more tension than any battlefield. Guilliman had faced demon primarchs and Xenos warlords. He had negotiated with alien civilizations and brokered deals that shaped the fates of entire sectors. But he had never encountered something that seemed so fundamentally outside the galaxy's established order. Something that offered stability without demanding worship, power without corruption, results without the inevitable price that everything in this galaxy exacted. In that moment, he made the first of many decisions that would reshape Imperium Nihilus. Not to destroy this anomaly immediately, as doctrine demanded, but to learn what it represented before determining whether it would be humanity's tool or its destruction. The meeting that followed would be remembered by those present as the moment the Imperium began to comprehend the existence of something it had no framework to classify. An entity that should not exist, operating through principles that denied everything the galaxy's power structures understood about the relationship between order and sacrifice. And in the shadows beyond the audience chamber, forces far older and more malevolent than the Imperium began to take notice of this new variable in their eternal games. The War Council assembled in the deepest levels of Macragi's honor, where even servitors were not permitted without specific authorization. Robut Guilliman sat at the head of the strategium table, his expression carved from the same stone as the statues that bore his likeness across 1,000,000 worlds. Around him gathered the power brokers of Imperium Nihilus, inquisitorial representatives from 3 ordos, senior chaplains of the Ultramarines, a delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus who had arrived specifically to examine the phenomenon. And displayed on a picti rasrine at the far end of the chamber, the entity that called itself Rimuru Tempest. The debate had raged for 6 hours. Every argument had been examined from multiple theological, strategic, and philosophical perspectives. The Inquisition demanded immediate exterminatas. The phenomena represented corruption of an unknown nature, and unknown corruption was the most dangerous kind. Better to destroy 17 systems than risk contamination spreading across Nihilus. The Mechanicus advocated for contained study. The entity's ability to create stability without warp interaction suggested technologies or principles that might revolutionize Imperial capabilities. To destroy it without understanding violated the very essence of the quest for knowledge. The chaplains remained divided. Some saw demonic deception in any power that did not flow from the Emperor's grace. Others noted that demonic influence typically announced itself through corruption and madness, neither of which were evident in the stabilized systems. Guilliman had listened to all perspectives, with the patience born of 10,000 years serving as the Imperium's administrator. He recognized the valid concerns in each argument. The Inquisition was not wrong to fear the unknown. The Mechanicus was not wrong to seek understanding. The chaplains were not wrong to demand theological clarity before acceptance. But he also recognized what none of them would say aloud. The Imperium was dying, slowly, inexorably collapsing under the weight of its own doctrinal rigidity. Nihilus had been cut off from the Astronomican's light for years now, and the miracle was not that some worlds had fallen, but that any had survived at all. If this entity truly offered a path to stability, without the usual price of corruption, rejecting it out of reflexive fear would be strategic suicide. "Enough," he said, and silence fell immediately. "I have reached a decision." The representatives leaned forward, each certain that their arguments had proven decisive. "We will establish what I am designating as Lord Regent's Special Compliance Zone Tempest Protectorate. The entity calling itself Rimuru Tempest will be permitted to maintain its sphere of influence under strict observation and specific constraints." Protest erupted from the inquisitorial representatives. Inquisitor Hexmark, her augmetic jaw clicking with agitation, rose from her seat. "My Lord Primarch, with all respect, this sets a catastrophic precedent. If we permit one anomaly to exist simply because it appears beneficial, we open the door to nothing." Guilliman interrupted his voice, carrying the weight that could command star fleets. "The decree is specific, limited, and revocable at any time. The Tempest Protectorate exists at my sufferance and my sufferance alone." He gestured to the tactical display where the affected systems glowed in amber, rather than the red of corruption or green of Xenos infestation. "These worlds are stable. Their citizens are productive. Chaos manifestations have ceased. These are facts, not theories or theological debates. And in Nihilus, facts of stability are worth more than entire fleets." Tech Priest Dominus Fane's optical sensors whirred as he processed this declaration. "What constraints do you propose, Lord Regent?" Guilliman activated the hololithic display, and a complex document materialized in the air above the table. The legal framework of the Protectorate decree filled dozens of pages, each line crafted with the precision of someone who had written the Codex Astartes. "First, the entity will submit to continuous monitoring. Inquisitorial observation posts will be established in every system under its influence. Second, any expansion beyond the current 17 systems requires my personal approval. Third, the entity will not proselytize established cults of personality or encourage worship of any kind. Fourth, at the first sign of corruption or deviation from established parameters, the Protectorate status is revoked, and exterminatus protocols activate immediately." He paused, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. "Fifth, and most critical kill switch contingencies will be embedded in every Protectorate world. Fleet assets capable of planetary sterilization will maintain permanent station at the Protectorate's borders. The entity will know at all times that cooperation is maintained through mutual benefit, not trust." The brilliance of the decree lay in its balance. It gave the Inquisition the tools to destroy what they feared, while preventing them from doing so out of mere paranoia. It gave the Mechanicus access to study, while preventing unrestricted experimentation. It gave the entity legitimacy, while making that legitimacy conditional and revocable. This is not alliance, Gilliman clarified. This is controlled utilization of a strategic asset. We use this thing's capabilities to stabilize Nihilus while preparing for the possibility that it represents our destruction. If it proves valuable, we benefit. If it proves dangerous, we terminate it with prejudice. And silence greeted this pronouncement. Each faction recognized that they had been given enough to prevent open rebellion, while being denied enough to prevent triumphalism. It was the art of imperial politics refined to its purest form. "The entity awaits your response, Lord Regent," Captain Ventress reported. Gilliman turned to face the pict screen where Rimuru's image waited with patient attention. "You will accept these terms. You will submit to monitoring. You will operate under constraints that would be considered intolerable by any sovereign power. In exchange, you will not be immediately destroyed. Do you understand?" Rimuru's expression showed neither triumph nor dismay. "I understand completely. You're offering me legitimacy in exchange for accepting that legitimacy can be revoked at any moment. It's pragmatic. I can work with pragmatic." "Then we have an accord," Gilliman said. "The Tempest Protectorate is hereby established under Imperial authority. May the Emperor have mercy on us all if this proves to be a mistake." The Council dispersed each faction, already preparing their next moves within the new framework. The Inquisition would establish observation posts and refine exterminatus protocols. The Mechanicus would deploy research teams disguised as routine tech support missions. The chaplains would monitor for signs of spiritual corruption while grappling with the theological implications of sanctioned heresy. And in the quiet of his private chambers, Robut Gilliman stood before a window overlooking the void between stars. He had made the decision that duty demanded balancing strategy against doctrine survival, against purity. But he could not shake the sense that he had just altered the Imperium's trajectory in ways that even his strategic genius could not fully predict. The entity had accepted constraints it could almost certainly break if it chose, which meant either it genuinely sought cooperation, or it was patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to reveal its true nature. Gilliman did not know which possibility disturbed him more. In the shadows of imperial power, a new variable had been legitimized, not trusted, not embraced, but permitted to exist within carefully defined boundaries that both sides understood could collapse at any moment. The Imperium Nihilus had gained a tool it did not understand, and a threat it could not yet eliminate. Whether that would prove to be salvation or damnation remained to be seen. The Hive fleet arrived at Anchor World Theta 9 without warning. One moment the system's augur arrays showed empty void. The next they registered biological signatures on a scale that defied comprehension. 17 bioships translated from the warp, their organic hulls pulsing with alien hunger as they oriented toward the inhabited world below. Fleet Admiral Castros watched the tactical displays with the fatalistic calm of someone who had served in Nihilus long enough to recognize inevitable doom. His battle group consisted of 3 frigates and a single cruiser, already damaged from previous engagements. Against even one bioship, they would be outmatched. Against 17, the question was not whether they would die, but how many minutes they could delay the inevitable consumption of 6 billion Imperial citizens. "Send word to Macragi's honor," he ordered. "Request immediate exterminatus authorization. If we cannot save Theta 9, we can at least deny the Tyranids their biomass." The Vox operator's hands trembled as he transmitted the request. Everyone aboard understood what exterminatus meant. 6 billion souls incinerated rather than devoured. It was the pragmatic choice, the strategic choice, the choice that would haunt anyone who survived to remember it. The response came not from Guillemon, but from the entity designated Rimuru Tempest. The message bypassed normal Vox protocols and manifested directly on every screen throughout the Imperial battle group simultaneously. I request authorization to intervene. Theta 9 can be saved without planetary sterilization. Admiral Castros had been briefed on the Protectorate decree, though his understanding remained limited. An entity of unknown origin permitted to exist within specific constraints, capable of producing stability through incomprehensible means. The reports had seemed like fever dreams. Now he found himself weighing the reality of immediate annihilation against the possibility of salvation from something he did not understand. "You have 60 minutes," he transmitted. "If the defense fails, I will execute exterminatus regardless of any objections." What emerged from Theta 9's surface moments later would be analyzed by Mechanicus Biologus adepts for years to come. The entity appeared to create portals, spatial anomalies that violated known physics but demonstrated perfect stability. Through these apertures poured what could only be described as a counter-swarm. Benimaru led the military response with tactical precision that impressed even veteran Imperial commanders. His forces established defensive perimeters around population centers with efficiency that would have taken standard Imperial Guard regiments days to achieve. Each position was perfectly calculated, overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones that channeled the descending tyrannid organisms into concentrated areas where they could be eliminated systematically. But the true horror, from the Imperial perspective, came from what happened to the tyrannid biomatter itself. Rimuru moved through the descending swarms, like an adaptive plague consuming genetic material on a scale that matched the Hive Fleet's own hunger. Where tyrannid organisms landed, they found themselves being absorbed by something that treated them as mere biomass to be processed and recycled. The entity designated Diablo coordinated with Ordo Malleus operatives who had been assigned to monitor the Protectorate. His cooperation proved disturbingly effective. Grey Knights, who had never worked with Xenos or entities outside Imperial doctrine, found themselves directing his capabilities toward synapse creatures with surgical precision. Each eliminated node disrupted the hive mind's coordination, creating cascading failures throughout the swarm's tactical cohesion. The battle raged for 18 hours. Imperial forces who had prepared for martyrdom instead found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. A tyrannid assault broken not through overwhelming firepower or sacrificial resistance, but through methodical counter-adaptation. The swarm that had devoured hundreds of worlds found itself being consumed in turn. When the last bioship withdrew its organic hull, scarred and depleted Theta 9 remained intact. Casualty reports indicated 73,000 civilian deaths, a number that would have been considered catastrophic in any other context. In Nihilus, it was miraculous. The world had survived. Its cities stood. Its people lived. Admiral Castros surveyed the aftermath in silence that stretched beyond uncomfortable into genuinely disturbing. His fleet had barely fired a shot. The enemy had been defeated by capabilities he could not explain, using principles he did not understand. Everything in his training, everything in Imperial doctrine insisted that such power must demand a terrible price. The entity appeared on his bridge without announcement, simply manifesting as it had during their initial communication. Castros noted that his ship's internal sensors had not detected the intrusion. His security protocols had failed completely. The thing could apparently appear anywhere within his vessel at will. Theta 9 is secure, Rimuru stated. Casualties were minimized. The tyrannid biomass has been processed and can be repurposed for reconstruction materials, if you wish. The Admiral found his voice after a moment. What you did should not be possible. The hive mind adapts to everything. It learns. It evolves. Nothing stops it except total annihilation. It adapted to this galaxy's capabilities, Rimuru replied. I'm not from this galaxy. Its adaptations don't account for external variables. In the inquisitorial observation post, orbiting Theta 9, the reaction was less relief than existential dread. Inquisitor Valkin reviewed the combat data for the 7th time, searching for any evidence of warp corruption or demonic influence that would justify immediate termination protocols. He found none. The entity had fought with clinical efficiency, demonstrating capabilities that should belong only to the Emperor himself, and showed no signs of the corruption that inevitably accompanied such power. His report to the Conclave carried recommendations that warred with each other. On one hand, the entity had just accomplished what would have required an entire battle fleet and still resulted in planetary destruction. On the other hand, anything capable of such feats represented a threat magnitude that exceeded most demonic incursions. The concluding paragraph of his report summarized the impossible position they now occupied. The anomaly designated Rimuru Tempest has demonstrated capabilities that render Exterminatus obsolete in scenarios where it operates. This represents either humanity's most valuable strategic asset in Nihilus or the most insidious threat we have ever failed to recognize. Recommend continued observation while accelerating development of termination protocols for contingency deployment. What the Inquisitor could not acknowledge in his official report, but understood with terrible clarity, was that the Imperium had just become dependent on something it could not control. Theta 9 had been saved. 6 billion lives continued. The strategic calculus of Nihilus had shifted in humanity's favor. But dependency bred vulnerability, and the Imperium had survived 10,000 years by ensuring it depended on nothing except the Emperor's will and the sacrifice of its own citizens. This new variable undermined that fundamental principle. It offered salvation without demanding the usual price, which meant either the price was hidden or would be extracted later when they could not refuse to pay. Roboute Guilliman received the reports aboard Macragi's honor with an expression that revealed nothing. He had authorized the intervention specifically to test the entity's capabilities under combat conditions. The results exceeded projections while confirming his deepest concerns. The thing could replace Exterminatus. That single fact altered the strategic landscape of Imperium Nihilus in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. Worlds that would have been sterilized to deny the enemy their resources could now potentially be saved. Millions, perhaps billions, of Imperial citizens could survive encounters that doctrine had written off as total losses. But what happened when the Imperium became dependent on this capabilities? What leverage would the entity gain as more worlds owed their survival to its intervention rather than the Emperor's sacrifice? How long before Imperial commanders requested its assistance as first resort rather than last resort? The Primarch activated a secure channel to his most trusted advisors and spoke words that would shape policy for the coming years. The asset has proven its utility. Now we must ensure that utility does not become necessity. Accelerate development of independent capabilities that can replicate its effects through Imperial-approved means. We cannot allow our survival to depend on something we do not understand. In the quiet moments after the channel closed, Guilliman permitted himself a moment of doubt. The Imperium he had helped build 10,000 years ago had been meant to free humanity from dependence on gods and supernatural powers. His father's vision had emphasized human capability, human ingenuity, human will. Now, he found himself authorizing cooperation with an entity that violated every principle that vision represented, not because he had faith in its benevolence, but because the alternative was watching Nihilus burn one exterminatus at a time until nothing remained worth saving. The price of survival grew steeper every day. Theta 9 had been saved, but something more fundamental than a single world had been lost in the process. The Imperium's absolute conviction that it controlled its own fate had cracked, revealing the uncomfortable truth that in this new era, survival might require accepting help from forces that should not exist. And in the deepest vaults of inquisitorial facilities throughout Nihilus, new protocols were being drafted. Contingency plans for the day when the entity proved to be exactly what doctrine insisted it must be. Plans that would require sacrificing everything they had just saved to eliminate the threat before it consumed them all. The weapon that could save humanity might ultimately be the weapon that destroyed it. The only question was whether they would recognize the moment of transformation before it became irreversible. The Psyker died screaming on the third day. Astropath Tertius Valen had served the Imperium for 47 years. His consciousness scoured raw by decades of exposure to the warp's caress. He had weathered demonic assaults on his sanity, navigated the Imperium's most treacherous currents, endured the psychic screams of dying worlds, transmitted across impossible distances. But 3 days within the Null Dominion reduced him to a broken shell curled in the corner of his meditation chamber, blood streaming from his eyes as he clawed at his own throat. "It hurts," he whispered through damaged vocal cords. "The silence hurts more than any demon ever did." The attending chirurgeon could do nothing but administer sedatives and document the deterioration. Valen was the 7th astropath to suffer complete psychological collapse within the Tempest Protectorate. The pattern was consistent. Those whose abilities required connection to the warp found that connection not severed, but inverted as though they were trying to drink from an empty well, while something pushed back against their consciousness. The Mechanicus biologist team studying the phenomenon compiled extensive data. Psychers experienced pain proportional to their psychic grade. Lower-grade talents reported discomfort and disorientation. Higher-grade Psychers, those whose abilities approached sanctioned levels, suffered agony that drove many to self-termination within hours. The Null Dominion did not simply block psychic phenomena. It created an active resistance that increased with the strength of the psychic attempt. In the upper spires of Anchor World, Epsilon 4, Navigator Matriarch Helene stood before her council chamber's viewing portal and studied the stars without using her warp eye. For the first time in 3 centuries, she could observe the physical universe without the overlay of Imperium currents. The experience left her feeling both liberated and hollow. "We are being rendered obsolete," she stated to the assembled navigator houses. "Within the Protectorate, our gifts serve no purpose. Ships navigate by stellar cartography rather than warp sight. Trade routes function without our guidance. Our family's 10,000-year monopoly on interstellar travel has been broken not by technology, but by the simple absence of need." The implications extended beyond professional obsolescence. Navigator bloodlines existed because the Imperium required their mutation. Remove that requirement, and the justification for their privileged status collapsed. Already she had received reports of noble houses questioning why they should honor ancient pacts with families whose abilities no longer functioned in stabilized space. Below the spires in the manufactorum districts where billions labored to meet production quotas, a different transformation was occurring. Crime rates had fallen to levels unprecedented in imperial record-keeping. Gang violence that typically consumed entire hive sectors simply ceased. Cult activity that festered in every underhive vanished as though it had never existed. Arbitrator General Kane reviewed the statistics with growing unease. His enforcers patrolled streets where citizens moved with mechanical efficiency, queuing for rations, without complaint reporting to their assigned labor shifts with perfect punctuality. Productivity metrics exceeded all projections. Social unrest indicators approached zero. "It's wrong," he confided to his second-in-command during a review session. "People aren't meant to be this compliant, this orderly. Even in the most disciplined hive cities, there's still human friction, disagreements, passions, arguments over ration distribution. Here, nothing. They just accept everything." His second, a veteran of 4 decades maintaining order in some of Nihilis's most violent sectors, nodded slowly. "It's like they've been sedated, sir. But the medical scans show no chemical alteration, no neural manipulation. They're simply calm." The psychological surveys revealed the truth. Citizens within the Protectorate experienced a gradual emotional flattening. Not the violent suppression of feeling that characterized ecclesiarchy indoctrination, but a gentle erosion of peaks and valleys. Joy became contentment. Anger became mild irritation. Fear transformed into abstract concern. The passions that drove humanity toward both greatness and damnation simply faded into a comfortable numbness. Chaplain Morteus identified the spiritual dimension of this transformation during his weekly sermon in the Cathedral of the Emperor's Light. He looked out upon his congregation and saw faces that were attentive but not rapturous, respectful but not zealous. When he spoke of the Emperor's sacrifice, they nodded with polite agreement rather than weeping with ecstatic devotion. After the service, he retreated to his private chapel and drafted a report to the ecclesiarchy's high command. The language he chose was precise, each word selected to convey the magnitude of what he witnessed. The Protectorate citizens have not lost their faith, they have lost their capacity for faith. Belief requires passion, and passion requires the ability to feel deeply. What remains is intellectual acceptance without spiritual fire. They worship as one might acknowledge a historical fact rather than embrace a divine truth. The inquisitorial observers documented these phenomena with clinical detachment. Their reports compiled evidence of what they termed beneficial degradation. The Protectorate was becoming more stable, more productive, more orderly. But it was also becoming less human in ways that defied easy categorization. Populations experienced reduced suffering. Demonic corruption found no purchase in minds that lacked the emotional intensity to fuel possession. Chaos cults could not form when citizens felt no desperate need for meaning beyond their assigned functions. The very vulnerabilities that made humanity susceptible to the ruinous powers were being eroded. But so were the qualities that made humanity worth preserving. The capacity for heroism required the possibility of cowardice. The achievement of virtue demanded the existence of vice. Remove the extremes, and what remained was a species optimized for survival, but devoid of the spark that justified that survival. In the Protectorate's 9th month, a minor rebellion erupted on Anchor World Gamma 2. 300 citizens gathered in an unauthorized assembly demanding the right to feel something beyond contentment. They called themselves the Reclamation, and their manifesto consisted of a single statement: "We would rather suffer as humans than exist as optimized machines." Imperial forces suppressed the uprising within 6 hours. The ease with which it was contained demonstrated the Protectorate's stability. The fact that it occurred at all demonstrated the stability's cost. Robute Guilliman reviewed the incident reports with an expression that would have troubled anyone who knew him well enough to read the subtle shifts in his features. The Primarch had spent 10,000 years struggling to preserve humanity against impossible odds. He had made countless pragmatic choices, sacrificing ideals for survival, trading purity for persistence. But this was different. The Protectorate offered safety at the cost of something more fundamental than doctrine or faith. It offered a humanity that could survive anything, because it no longer possessed anything worth destroying. A civilization of the content, the stable, the emotionally neutered. His final notation in the strategic assessment carried implications that would shape policy for years to come. The Protectorate succeeds in preserving human life while gradually eliminating human nature. We must determine whether this represents an acceptable trade. More critically, we must determine whether we retain the capacity to reverse this transformation should we conclude it has gone too far. The question remained unanswered, because answering it would require choosing between survival and meaning, between existence and purpose. And in Imperium Nihilus, where every choice carried impossible weight, even the Primarch found himself unable to determine which price was too high to pay. The Null Dominion expanded. Citizens lived longer, healthier, safer lives. And day by day, the fire that made them human dimmed toward comfortable extinction. The Forge World Omnissiah's Meridian had existed for 8,000 years as a monument to orthodox doctrine. Its forge masters had rejected innovation in favor of proven templates, maintaining STC patterns with religious devotion, while viewing deviation as heresy against the machine god's perfection. Then Velgrind arrived, and orthodoxy shattered. She came not as conqueror, but as proposition. The dragon, true manifestation of order, rendered in physical form, stood before Fabricator General Zan 7, and demonstrated principles that should not function according to established Mechanicus theology. Energy manipulation without plasma containment, material transformation without chemical processes, computational architecture that operated outside binary logic. Zan 7's augmetic consciousness struggled to process what his optical sensors reported. The entity before him violated fundamental axioms of the Omnissiah's teachings, yet functioned with precision that exceeded Mars's most sacred technology. His logic engines generated cascading errors as they attempted to reconcile observation with doctrine. "You understand systems," Velgrind stated, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the Forge's machine spirits. "You worship efficiency and order. I am order. Work with me and I will show you principles that transcend your current limitations." The Fabricator General's response emerged through multiple Vox synthesizers, simultaneously his consciousness fragmenting across processing nodes as he grappled with theological crisis. The quest for knowledge is sacred, but knowledge that contradicts the Omnissiah's teachings leads to tech heresy. Your very existence challenges 10,000 years of established doctrine. Then your doctrine is incomplete, Velgrind replied without inflection. "I am not asking you to abandon your beliefs. I am offering to expand them." Within 48 hours, Omnissiah's Meridian had fractured into theological civil war. The faction that emerged called themselves Logic Orthodox Tech Priests, who argued that refusing to study a demonstrably superior system violated the very essence of the quest for knowledge. Their opponents, traditionalists who maintained that orthodoxy itself was sacred, branded them as tech heretics deserving of immediate purging. The schism spread beyond Omnissiah's Meridian within weeks. Across Nihilus, Mechanicus' Forge world split between those who saw Velgrind as the ultimate test of their faith and those who saw her as its ultimate corruption. Skitarii legions that had fought side by side for millennia now turned weapons on each other in Manufactorum districts, where both factions claimed the machine god's favor. Dark Mechanicus warbands, observing from the warp's edge, declared total war against the Logic Orthodox. They had abandoned Mars's teachings in pursuit of forbidden innovation, only to watch sanctioned heretics embrace principles that made their own corruption seem quaint. Their attacks came with fanatical fury, each raid targeting logic orthodox facilities with prejudice born of ideological betrayal. While the Mechanicus tore itself apart over theological purity, Veldora Tempest was solving a different problem entirely. The Necron tomb complex on Solemnas had awakened its overlord commanding legions of soulless warriors with strategic genius refined over 60 million years. Standard Imperial doctrine called for immediate exterminatus. Veldora called for conversation. The attempt should have been impossible. Necrons did not negotiate with lesser species. They harvested or they exterminated, guided by protocols older than human civilization. But Veldora was not human, and his existence operated on principles that Necron logic matrices found genuinely novel. Overlord Zandrek observed the dragon entity with sensors that predated Terra's formation. His consciousness, fragmented by the biotransference's flaws, occasionally mistook Veldora for a Eldar war leader or Xetan's shard. But in moments of clarity, he recognized something unprecedented. An entity that existed outside the warp's influence, yet demonstrated power comparable to the ancient star gods themselves. "You are not chaos," Zahandrek stated, his voice synthesized through speakers designed to intimidate organic prey. "You are not Eldar. You are not any classification in 60 million years of recorded data." Veldora grinned with an expression that would have seemed absurd on something so fundamentally powerful. "I'm Veldora Tempest, and I'm here to propose we stop trying to kill each other long enough to kill something we both hate more." The proposal was simple. Necrons sought to restore their ancient empire by purging the galaxy of warp corruption. Veldora's presence already created zones where warp influence failed. A temporary alliance to eliminate chaos strongholds before resuming their inevitable conflict served both parties' strategic interests. Zandrek, in a moment of lucidity, recognized the logic. More critically, he recognized the opportunity to study an entity that might provide insights into countering the C'tan's remaining influence. He agreed with the explicit understanding that the alliance terminated the moment chaos ceased to be the primary threat. The Silent King, monitoring events from the galaxy's edge, issued immediate orders forbidding any such cooperation. His decree reached Zandrek's tomb world 3 days after the alliance had already been formalized. The Overlord's response was to sever communication protocols with the Sautek dynasty entirely and declare his tomb world independent. Within months, 12 Necron dynasties had followed Zandrek's precedent. Some genuinely believed cooperation with the anomaly served their strategic restoration objectives. Others simply used the controversy as justification for rebellion against the Silent King's authority that they had resented for millennia. The Necron race, already fractured by the Great Sleep's inconsistent awakening, now fragmented further along ideological lines that would have seemed impossible to species that had abandoned ideology 60 million years prior. In the Webway's twilight paths, Guy Crimson walked beside Harlequin Shadow Seer Salandri with the casual confidence of someone who knew they were the most dangerous thing in any given space. The Eldar should have killed him on sight. Ancient enmity demanded it. But Salandri had glimpsed something in the skein of fate that troubled her more than any individual threat. "The Null Dominion grows," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke to multiple possible futures simultaneously. "It spreads through real space like crystallizing ice. And where it touches, dreams die." "Dreams die everywhere," Guy replied. "That's what makes them dreams." "You misunderstand. Not metaphorical dreams. the dream itself. The fundamental capacity for consciousness to touch the Imperium. What your slime ally has created does not simply block the warp. It renders the warp irrelevant. If it spreads far enough, it will strangle the gestalt unconscious that birthed Slanesh. It will kill our gods before we can birth new ones. Guy's expression showed interest for the first time. And this concerns me because Salandri's mask shifted to display a laughing skull. You exist in equilibrium with chaos. You are powerful because the warp is powerful. Diminish one and you diminish yourself. The Null Dominion does not discriminate between demon and dragon. It rejects all equally. The alliance that formed was not cooperation, but mutual survival instinct. Harlequins would monitor the Null Dominion's expansion and alert Guy to critical thresholds. Guy would intervene if the expansion threatened fundamental reality structures that even he required for existence. Neither trusted the other. Both understood that the enemy of one's existence was everyone's enemy. The Compact's existence sent shockwaves through the Elder Craft worlds. Autarchs who had spent millennia hunting demons now watched Harlequins coordinate with one of Chaos's most powerful entities. Accusations of corruption spread through the path systems. Civil conflict erupted as Craft worlds split between those who trusted the Harlequins' precognition and those who saw only another demon's deception. Within 6 months of the Protectorate's establishment, every major galactic faction had fractured along lines defined by their response to the Null Dominion's existence. The Mechanicus warred with itself over theological interpretation. The Necrons split between those who saw strategic opportunity and those who demanded absolute independence. The Eldar divided over whether cooperation with any warp entity could be justified, even for survival. Robut Gilliman reviewed the cascade of schisms from Makraiji's honor with an expression that had not changed in 3 weeks. His strategic assessments reached the same conclusion regardless of how many times he recalculated the variables. The Protectorate had achieved its intended purpose of stabilizing Nihilus. But the stability came at the cost of fracturing every power structure that might have contained its growth. The Mechanicus could not present unified opposition because half their priesthood now viewed the entity as sacred. The Necrons could not coordinate extinction protocols because their dynasties had chosen opposing sides. The Eldar could not execute assassination plans because their seers disagreed on whether the target's death would worsen the crisis. The Imperium had gained a tool that could save worlds. But that tool had also become a wedge driven into the heart of every civilization capable of challenging its existence. Whether through deliberate design or inevitable consequence, the entity had secured its survival by making unified opposition impossible. In the Protectorate's administrative center, Rimuru received reports of the spreading conflicts with an expression that revealed nothing. Shion had advocated for direct intervention to stop the bloodshed. Benamaru had argued for exploitation of the chaos to expand territorial claims. Shuna had recommended maintaining strict neutrality to avoid further destabilization. Rimuru's actual thoughts remained private. But the fact that the schisms continued without Protectorate interference suggested a decision had been made. The galaxy was tearing itself apart over questions of how to respond to something it could not categorize or control. And the thing itself simply continued to exist, growing more entrenched with every faction that split over the question of its nature. The Imperium had wanted to use the Protectorate as a tool. Instead, the Protectorate had become the fulcrum around which every galactic power structure was being forced to redefine itself. And there was no clear path back to the certainties that had existed before it arrived. Order had come to Nihilus, but order, it turned out, was just another word for transformation that happened whether you agreed to it or not. The phenomenon began in the Gorkamorka Belt, a debris field where orc spores had gestated in the wreckage of 1,000 forgotten battles. The greenskins there had always been particularly savage, their genetic memory saturated with violence from millennia of accumulated warfare. But what emerged after Milim Nava's arrival transcended even orc standards of brutality. She had not come seeking them. The dragon demon lord had simply been bored, drawn to the loudest concentration of fighting she could detect within the protectorate's expanding sphere. What she found was a wog in its infancy, thousands of boys preparing for a raid against an imperial outpost. What they found was something that made even orc survival instincts scream warnings their conscious minds were too dim to process. The first war boss to challenge her died without understanding what killed him. Milim's casual backhand strike generated force that translated the orc leader into component atoms across a 3-kilometer radius. The resulting crater became a shrine within hours, orcs gathering at its edges with a reverence their species had never demonstrated toward anything except violence itself. They called her Da Pink Boss. The name spread through the greenskin collective consciousness with the speed of psychic osmosis. Not through language, but through the gestalt field that bound all orcs into a species-wide network of shared experience. Every orc in the belt knew simultaneously that something impossibly strong had arrived. Something that fought for the pure joy of fighting something that embodied wag in its most distilled form. War boss Grimtooth Skull Kraka was the first to understand the implications. He was unusually cunning for an orc, his brain scarred by so many combats that it had developed capacity for something approaching strategic thought. He gathered his knobs in the ruins of a crashed Imperial cruiser and spoke words that would reshape orc culture across 3 sectors. "The Pink Boss ain't here to fight us," he rumbled, his massive jaw working around tusks decorated with the teeth of space marines. "She's here to show us how to fight right. No more wasting time crumping each other. We follow the Pink Boss and she'll lead us to the biggest fights in the whole galaxy." The concept should have been impossible. Orcs fought each other as naturally as breathing. Interclan warfare was their default state, violence against rivals the foundation of their social structure. But Milim represented something that overrode those fundamental drives. She was proof that there existed opponents strong enough to make fighting each other seem wasteful. Within 6 weeks, the Gorkamorka Belt WAG had unified under a banner that featured Milim's crude likeness rendered in pink and red war paint. The boys who followed Grimtooth stopped raiding each other's settlements and started preparing for something unprecedented in orc history: coordinated, sustained warfare against targets selected for maximum challenge rather than maximum loot. The first Imperial observers dismissed it as typical greenskin chaos. The second wave of reports triggered emergency protocols when analysts realized what they were witnessing. The orcs were evolving. Not in the slow genetic sense of normal orc development, but in rapid behavioral adaptation driven by exposure to something their species had never encountered before. Mech boys who previously built ramshackle weapons began incorporating principles they could not possibly understand, but somehow implemented correctly. Weapons that should not function according to any physical law achieved reliability through the orc gestalt field's concentrated belief. But now that belief was being shaped by the example of Milim's casual demonstrations of power. War bosses emerged who matched the size and strength of orc leaders who had fought for centuries. Except these new champions had gestated and risen to dominance in mere months, their development accelerated by the psychic pressure of needing to prove themselves worthy of fighting alongside the Pink Boss. The tipping point came when Grimtooth led his WAG against a chaos warband that had been terrorizing the sector for decades. The battle lasted 7 hours. When it ended, the Chaos Lord's skull decorated Grimtooth's banner, and Millennium sat on a pile of demon-slain corpses, looking disappointed. "That was too easy," she announced to the assembled orcs. "I want something harder. Find me real fighters, or I'll get bored and leave." The threat of her departure triggered something approaching panic in the orc collective consciousness. They had tasted warfare at a level that made their previous battles seem like children's games. The thought of returning to the mundane savagery of pre-millennium existence was intolerable. Grimtooth made a decision that would have been impossible for any orc before this evolutionary moment. He declared that the Pink Boss's WAG would march against the Imperium's strongest fortresses, against Xenos empires, against anything powerful enough to provide the challenge she demanded. Not for loot, not for territory, but for the pure purpose of finding opponents worthy of her attention. The philosophical implications of purpose-driven orc warfare rippled through Imperial strategic assessments like shockwaves. An enemy that fought for pleasure was predictable. An enemy that fought for survival was manageable. An enemy that fought to prove themselves worthy to something stronger than themselves was fundamentally different. Worse, they were succeeding. WAG! Grimtooth tore through 3 Imperial defensive lines in 2 months. Each victory brought more orcs to the Pink Boss's banner, drawn by psychic resonance from sectors away. The WAG was growing not through normal orc reproduction, but through ideological conversion of existing greenskin populations. Rimuru received the first reports with an expression that remained carefully neutral. Shion had brought the intelligence directly, her concern evident in her posture. The document detailed orc populations abandoning conventional WAG patterns to join Millennium's crusade. Estimates suggested the WAG could reach critical mass within 6 months, at which point it would rival the beast's legendary horde. "We need to recall her," Shion stated flatly. "This has gone beyond acceptable parameters." "She's not doing anything wrong," Benamaru interjected from his position by the chamber's tactical display. "The orcs were already enemies of the Imperium. Millennium is simply redirecting their aggression toward larger targets." "She's creating an existential threat," Shion countered. "The Imperium tolerates the Protectorate because we maintain stability. This is the opposite of stability." Rimuru listened to both arguments, fingers steepled in thought. The situation had developed exactly as predictably as Millennium's nature would suggest. She found strong opponents. She fought them. She inspired others to seek stronger opponents. The cycle was entirely consistent with everything they knew about her. The problem was not her actions, but their consequences. The WAG she had inadvertently created represented the first serious threat to the delicate equilibrium that kept the Protectorate from being classified as an immediate danger. If it continued growing, Guilliman would have no choice but to reassess whether the benefits of cooperation outweighed the costs of allowing it to continue. "I'll talk to her," Rimuru finally said. "Talking to Millennium about restraint," Benamaru observed dryly, "has historically achieved limited success." "Then I'll do more than talk." The journey to find Millennium took 3 days. She had moved to a new battlefront, this time engaging a Necron tomb world that Grimtooth had identified as sufficiently challenging. When Rimuru arrived, the battle was already underway. Orcs and Necrons clashed in a violence that shook the planet's crust, while Millennium sat atop a throne of broken Canoptech constructs, watching the carnage with the enthusiasm of a child at a playground. "Rimuru," she waved energetically. "You came to watch. Isn't this great? These metal guys are way tougher than the last bunch." Rimuru observed the battlefield for a long moment before speaking. "Millennium, we need to discuss the situation you've created." Her expression shifted from joy to wariness in an instant. "I'm just having fun. You said we could help if it was interesting. I said we could help maintain stability. This is the opposite. But they're happy. Millennium gestured at the orcs below. Look at them. They're fighting better opponents than they ever could have before. I'm making them better. You're making them dangerous. To the Imperium. To the balance we're trying to maintain. To themselves. Millennium's eyes narrowed. So what I'm supposed to stop? Go back to being bored while everyone else gets to do interesting things. The tension in the air acquired weight. Nearby orcs, sensing something through their psychic connection to the pink boss, began backing away from the confrontation. Even Grimtuff, who had fought demons without fear, felt his survival instincts screaming to retreat. I'm asking you, Rimuru said carefully, to consider the consequences of your actions beyond the immediate satisfaction they provide. The wag you've inspired will eventually require a response we're not prepared to make. Then get prepared, Millennium shot back. I'm not going to stop fighting just because it makes things complicated for you. The standoff lasted for several seconds that felt like hours. Then Rimuru sighed, the sound carrying profound weariness. I'm not ordering you to stop. I'm asking you to redirect. Find challenges that don't threaten everything we've built. Millennium's stance relaxed fractionally. Fine, but you find me something good to fight, or I'm going back to the orcs. They appreciate me. As Rimuru departed, leaving Millennium to her battle, the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily. The Protectorate had just experienced its first internal crisis, not from external pressure or ideological conflict, but from the fundamental incompatibility between maintaining order and accommodating a being whose nature was chaos incarnate. The situation would require monitoring, adjustment, possibly intervention beyond mere conversation. But most troubling was the realization that Millennium's argument was not entirely wrong. The orcs were happier. They were evolving in ways that made them more effective. The problem was that evolution served no one's interests except their own desire for worthy combat. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, creating an enemy that fought better was indistinguishable from creating an enemy that killed more efficiently. Good intentions meant nothing when measured against body counts. The Protectorate's first civil conflict had been resolved without violence. But the resolution felt more like postponement than solution. And postponement in Warhammer 40,000 was simply another word for inevitable catastrophe approaching on its own schedule. The demon died without screaming. Diablo's hand remained extended where the greater demon's essence had been moments before wisps of dissolving warp energy trailing from his fingers like smoke. Around him, the ritual chamber that had housed the summoning circle was pristine. No residual corruption, no lingering taint, just absence where abomination had stood. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Malleus lowered his force staff, the psychic energy that had been prepared for banishment dissipating unused. His Grey Knight Honor Guard maintained defensive positions, their blessed weapons still tracking for threats that no longer existed. The silence that followed was profound enough to be uncomfortable. You terminated it without engaging the warp? Covenant finally stated, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone forcing observation over incredulity. No psychic manifestation, no reality distortion. The demon simply ceased. Diablo turned to face the Inquisitor with a slight bow that somehow managed to convey respect while maintaining absolute superiority. The warp is not the only mechanism through which existence can be edited. Your methods are effective but unnecessarily dramatic. The statement should have been heresy. Instead, it was simple truth delivered with the calm certainty of someone explaining basic physics. Covenant had spent 3 centuries hunting demons across the galaxy. He knew every established protocol, every sanctioned technique, every prayer and ritual approved by the Ordo Malleus for combating warp entities. What he had just witnessed existed outside that entire framework. The cult that summoned this demon operated for 6 months before we detected them. Covenant said, gesturing to the chamber's antechamber where cultist corpses lay in neat rows. Their executions had been equally clean. No torture, no interrogation scars, just death delivered with professional efficiency. How did you locate them in 3 hours? I followed the resonance of their intentions. Chaos corruption announces itself to those who know how to listen without being corrupted by the listening. Covenant exchanged glances with Brother Captain Stern, his Grey Knight commander. The warrior's expression remained hidden behind his helmet, but his body language conveyed the same thought they both shared. This entity represented either the greatest asset the Imperium had gained in millennia, or the most insidious threat they had failed to recognize. Over the following months, cooperation deepened through necessity. Diablo demonstrated capabilities that solved problems the Ordo Malleus had struggled with for centuries. Diamond infiltration that typically required months of investigation to uncover could be identified in hours. Warp-touched artifacts that demanded extensive ritual purification were simply neutralized. Chaos cults that had festered for generations were eliminated with surgical precision that left no collateral damage. The efficiency was seductive. Covenant found himself authorizing joint operations with increasing frequency, justifying each decision with impeccable strategic logic. A cult on Tertius Prime that would have required planetary quarantine was eliminated in a single night. A demon prince manifesting on Valdris was terminated before it could fully materialize. Greater demons that would have demanded Grey Knight chapter-level responses were handled by a single entity wearing a butler's demeanor. But seduction bred dependency, and dependency bred questions. Inquisitor Hexmark of the Ordo Hereticus raised those questions during a conclave on the fortress world of Titan. Her dossier on the Protectorate covered 300 pages of meticulously documented anomalies, and she reserved her sharpest analysis for Diablo, specifically. He eliminates demons more effectively than our finest demon hunters, she stated to the assembled Inquisitors. He locates corruption faster than our most powerful psychers. He operates without fatigue, without error, without the spiritual toll that breaks even Grey Knights after decades of service. These capabilities should inspire gratitude. Instead, they should inspire terror. He fights our enemies, Covenant countered. 7 major demon incursions neutralized in 4 months. That's a record no single asset has achieved in living memory. Exactly. Hexmark leaned forward, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the hollow projection displaying Diablo's mission record. He's too effective. Which means either he possesses capabilities that fundamentally alter our understanding of how demon hunting functions, or he possesses those capabilities because he shares fundamental characteristics with what he hunts. The logic was impeccable and damning. The Ordo Malleus existed because conventional warfare could not combat warp entities. Psychic powers were required. Blessed weapons were necessary. Ritual purification was essential. Yet Diablo operated outside all those requirements while achieving superior results. The only explanation was that he functioned through principles that intersected with demonic nature itself. We have protocols, Inquisitor Lord Kieran stated from his position at the conclave's head. The Protectorate exists under specific constraints. If the entity designated Diablo violates those constraints, we terminate cooperation and implement containment measures. And if those measures prove insufficient, Hexmark asked, then we implement exterminatus on every world he has touched and pray to the Emperor that we acted quickly enough. The decision that emerged from the conclave was classified under the highest security protocols. Diablo would continue cooperation with Ordo Malleus operations. His effectiveness was too valuable to waste, while the strategic situation in Nihilus remained critical. But contingency protocols would be developed in parallel classified operations designed to study his methods, identify vulnerabilities, and prepare termination options. The file was designated Excommunicate Traitorous Extremis. Its existence was known to 17 inquisitors across 3 ordos. None of them spoke of it to the entity whose destruction it planned. Diablo continued his work with the same impeccable efficiency. If he sensed the shifting attitudes within the Inquisition, he gave no indication. His cooperation remained flawless. His results remained undeniable. And beneath that perfect surface, contingencies accumulated like pressure behind a dam. Brother Captain Stern began cataloging Diablo's combat patterns, searching for moments of vulnerability that might be exploited. Tech priests analyzed residual energy signatures from his demon terminations, looking for frequencies that conventional weapons might target. Assassination specialists modeled scenarios for simultaneous strikes across multiple locations, calculating whether distributed attacks could overwhelm his demonstrated capabilities. Each study reached the same conclusion. Terminating Diablo would require resources on the scale of a chapter-level deployment, with success probability below 40%. The entity was simply too fast, too aware, too capable of counters that conventional tactical doctrine could not predict. But 40% was not zero, and the Imperium had survived 10,000 years by taking terrible risks when necessity demanded. Covenant received the preliminary assessment in his private chambers aboard the inquisitorial fortress Adamant Resolve. The document outlined 12 different termination scenarios, each calibrated for specific tactical situations. None offered certainty. All demanded sacrifice that would cripple Ordo Malleus operations across 2 sectors. He read through the scenarios twice, then activated his most secure Vox channel. This is Covenant. Authorization Omega-7 Tertius. Begin fabrication of contingency assets per scenario Delta 9. Classify all manufacturing records under throne-level encryption. The response was immediate. Confirmed, Lord Inquisitor. Estimated completion 6 months. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. Covenant echoed, deactivating the channel. In the silence that followed, he contemplated the paradox that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. Diablo had saved more Imperial lives in 4 months than most Inquisitors saved in careers spanning centuries. His cooperation had been absolute. His loyalty to Rimuru Tempest appeared genuine. His effectiveness against chaos was unprecedented. And none of that mattered, because the Imperium's survival depended on trusting nothing that could not be controlled. Power without constraint was indistinguishable from threat. Capability without oversight was heresy waiting to reveal itself. The entity would continue serving until the moment it proved dangerous. And when that moment came, the Inquisition would be ready with protocols designed to eliminate what they could not understand, executed by warriors willing to die, ensuring the threat died with them. Covenant stared at the termination scenarios for a long moment, then filed them in encrypted storage. 6 months until the contingency weapons were ready. 6 months of continued cooperation. 6 months of pretending that partnership was anything other than postponed execution. In the grim darkness of the far future, even salvation required preparation for its own destruction. The knife was being sharpened. The only question was when the Imperium would find the courage to use it. The infection began in the Cathedral of Divine Certitude, on anchor world Theta 3, though no one recognized it as infection at the time. Cardinal Hesperus delivered his weekly sermon with the same passionate conviction that had earned him his rank. But his words carried a new edge that congregation members would later describe as unusually persuasive. "The Emperor protects," he proclaimed from his pulpit of polished obsidian. "But what protects us from those who claim to serve him while operating outside his divine order? What salvation can be found in stability purchased through compromise with entities that should not exist?" The sermon was transmitted across 17 worlds through standard ecclesiarchy channels. Within 3 days, similar rhetoric emerged from pulpits across the Protectorate's border regions. Within a week, 3 planetary governors received petitions demanding the expulsion of Protectorate influence from their systems. Within 2 weeks, the first riots erupted. Inquisitor Covenant recognized the pattern because he had studied chaos corruption for 3 centuries. This was not organic theological debate. This was coordinated manipulation ideas planted with surgical precision to exploit existing tensions. The evidence appeared in the synchronization: different worlds, different cultures, different theological traditions. Yet the arguments emerged simultaneously with identical phrasing. "Tzinch," he stated during an emergency Vox conference with Robert Guilliman. "The architect of fate is orchestrating this. Chaos has adapted its approach. If it cannot corrupt the Protectorate directly, it will turn the Imperium against it." Guilliman's image on the holoprojector showed no emotion, but his fingers drummed once against his command throne's armrest. The gesture was microscopic and telling. Cardinal Hesperus has impeccable theological credentials. His objections carry weight with the ecclesiarchy. We cannot simply dismiss him as corrupted without evidence. The evidence is the pattern itself. These arguments emerge too perfectly, too simultaneously, which proves coordination, not chaos influence. The cardinal could simply be correct. The Protectorate represents theological deviation. That deviation has consequences we may not have adequately considered. Covenant felt the conversation slipping toward conclusions he could not accept. "Lord Guilliman, if we allow ecclesiarchy politics to override strategic necessity..." "Strategic necessity is precisely what concerns me," the Primarch interrupted. "The Protectorate has created dependencies we cannot sustain if theological opposition fractures imperial unity. We must choose between maintaining an asset that half the Imperium considers heretical, or maintaining the ideological cohesion that allows the Imperium to function at all." The crisis escalated with geometric progression. Cardinal Hesperus called for a theological conclave on Ophelia VII, the ecclesiarchy's second most holy world. His faction, which now included 17 cardinals and 43 bishops, demanded formal classification of the Protectorate as unsanctioned deviation requiring imperial correction. The opposing faction, led by Cardinal Matthias of Cypramundi, argued that results superseded doctrine. His evidence was irrefutable mortality rates in Protectorate-adjacent systems had decreased by 40%. Chaos corruption had dropped to measurable lows. Production efficiency exceeded pre-rift standards. Both sides marshaled arguments with religious fervor. Both claimed the Emperor's will. Both were technically correct, according to different interpretations of imperial theology. Guy Crimson observed the escalating crisis with an expression that would have troubled anyone who knew him well enough to read the subtle shifts in his features. He sat in conference with Harlequin Shadowseer Salandri in a location that existed between real space and webway, discussing implications that transcended the Imperium's immediate concerns. "Tzench is playing both sides," Salandri stated, her mask shifting to display interlocking gears. "The Cardinal genuinely believes his arguments. The opposition genuinely believes theirs, but both paths lead to the same destination: conflict that weakens everyone except chaos. And if the Imperium destroys the Protectorate, Guy asked, then the Null Dominion's expansion halts. The warp reasserts itself, and the Great Game resumes with renewed vigor. Tsench wins, and if the Protectorate survives through Imperial schism, then the Imperium fractures its unity, replaced by ideological civil war. Chaos infiltrates both factions. Tsench wins differently, but still wins. Guy's smile carried no warmth. Then we ensure the conflict resolves in a manner Tsench did not anticipate. The theological conclave convened on Ophelia VII with all the ceremony such occasions demanded. Cardinals arrived from across the galaxy, their retinues filling the Holy World spaceports. The debates would determine not just the Protectorate's fate, but the Imperium's approach to unprecedented phenomena for generations to come. Cardinal Hesperus opened the first session with words that would be quoted for centuries. We stand at a crossroads between pragmatic survival and spiritual truth. The Protectorate offers us safety from chaos, at the cost of accepting something that operates by principles we cannot classify within the Emperor's divine framework. I submit that safety purchased through theological compromise is not safety at all, but slow surrender. Cardinal Matthias responded with equal conviction. The Emperor protects through many instruments. To reject one because it operates through mechanisms we do not yet understand is to limit the Emperor's will to our finite comprehension. The Protectorate has saved billions of Imperial lives. That result speaks with divine authority. The debate raged for 6 days. Arguments became heated. Theological positions hardened. On the 7th day, as the conclave prepared to vote on a formal declaration, Guy Crimson's intervention arrived in the form of information that should not have been obtainable. The evidence appeared on data slates throughout the conclave chamber simultaneously. Encrypted communications between Cardinal Hesperus's inner circle and entities that analysis suggested were warp-touched. Not demons, not obvious corruption, but contact with forces that whispered suggestions the Cardinal's faction had adopted as their own insights. Hesperus's face drained of color as he read the evidence. His theological certainty remained intact, but the source of that certainty had been revealed as tainted. The Cardinal, who had spoken with such conviction against compromise with the unknowable, had himself been compromised by the unknowable. The conclave dissolved into chaos. Accusations flew. Some cardinals demanded Hesperus's immediate arrest. Others questioned the evidence's authenticity. Still others suggested that even tainted sources could speak truth, that corruption of the messenger did not invalidate the message. Gilliman watched the proceedings through secure Vox links from Macragy's honor and made the decision that duty demanded. He issued orders for immediate deployment of fleet assets to anchor World Theta 3. If the theological crisis could not be resolved through debate, it would be resolved through the final authority the Imperium possessed. Diablo received intelligence about the fleet movements 3 hours before they commenced. His sources within the Inquisition had proven valuable in precisely this scenario. He transmitted the information to Rimuru with clinical efficiency. Fleet assets are being positioned for exterminatus. Target anchor World Theta 3. Estimated time to firing position 18 hours. Rimuru's response came without hesitation. Deploy countermeasures. We cannot allow them to destroy a populated world over theological politics. The decision has strategic logic, Diablo observed. Theta 3 has become the focal point for anti-protectorate sentiment. Its destruction would eliminate the opposition's symbolic center and kill 6 billion people who have no part in this debate beyond living in the wrong location. The Imperium makes such calculations routinely. We don't. The 18 hours that followed would be analyzed by Imperial strategists for decades. Protectorate forces mobilized with unprecedented speed. Benimaru coordinated defensive deployments across 3 systems simultaneously. Shuna established diplomatic channels with moderate cardinals, offering evidence that chaos manipulation extended beyond Hesperus. Guy Crimson appeared personally on Ophelia 7 to present additional intelligence that devastated the theological opposition's remaining credibility. But the most critical intervention occurred in the space above Theta 3 itself. When the Imperial fleet arrived and Admiral Castros received authorization to commence, Exterminatus Rimuru materialized on his flagship's bridge through mechanisms that bypassed every security protocol. The Admiral's hand froze on the firing authorization console. His honor guard raised weapons that he knew with absolute certainty would be ineffective. Rimuru spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. "Admiral, I understand your orders. I understand the logic behind them. But I cannot permit you to execute them." Castros found his voice through decades of military discipline. "You would commit open rebellion against Imperial authority. I would prevent mass murder justified through political convenience. The Imperium does not negotiate with entities that defy direct orders. Then the Imperium will need to decide whether destroying one world is worth the cost of the conflict that will follow." The standoff lasted for 17 minutes. During that time, additional Protectorate assets translated into the system. Not warships designed for conquest, but defensive platforms that positioned themselves between the Imperial fleet and the planet below. The message was clear. Exterminatus would require fighting through a defensive network that would inflict casualties the fleet could not sustain. Admiral Castros recognized defeat when tactical reality made it undeniable. He transmitted a request for clarification of orders to Guilliman. The response took 2 hours to arrive, and when it came, it carried the weight of a Primarch accepting the limits of his authority. "Stand down. Return to base. The matter requires alternative resolution." But alternative resolution came too late for Anchor World Sigma 9. While attention focused on Theta 3, a different faction within the Inquisition had implemented their own solution to the crisis. The Exterminatus happened before anyone could intervene. 4 billion souls incinerated because their world's governor had publicly supported Protectorate policies. The news reached both Guilliman and Rimuru simultaneously. The Primarch's response was contained within official channels, court-martials, and censures that would satisfy legal requirements while changing nothing fundamental. Rimuru's response was silence that somehow conveyed more than any statement could. In the aftermath, as the crisis wound down through exhaustion rather than resolution, 3 truths emerged that would shape the Imperium's future. The Protectorate could not be destroyed through conventional means without costs the Imperium could not afford. The Imperium could not trust the Protectorate because trust required understanding that remained impossible. And chaos would exploit the gap between these truths for as long as both entities existed. Cardinal Hesperus died by his own hand 3 days after the evidence of his manipulation became public. His final testimony, recorded and authenticated by the Inquisition, acknowledged that his theological objections had been genuine, even if their source had been tainted. The question of whether tainted sources could speak truth remained unresolved. Guilliman added a new entry to his private strategic assessments, classified under protocols that would outlive him. The Protectorate has proven it can defend itself. It has proven it will defend itself. We have proven we cannot eliminate it without costs that exceed the threat it poses. This creates an equilibrium of mutual deterrence that resembles peace, but is more accurately described as postponed inevitable conflict. 4 billion dead on Sigma 9 stood as testament to the cost of that equilibrium. The fact that the deaths changed nothing made them worse than meaningless. They were proof that in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even victory felt like failure when measured against what had been sacrificed to achieve it. The War of Three Truths had ended. Law, faith, and strategic necessity had each proven insufficient alone and incompatible together. What remained was not resolution, but exhaustion masquerading as peace. And in the warped Cinch laughed because even stalemate served the architect of fate when it bred the despair that would eventually demand change at any price. The Tempest Protectorate endured, not through conquest or conversion, but through the simple fact that no faction possessed both the will and the capacity to destroy it. The Imperium remained divided between those who saw pragmatic necessity and those who saw theological catastrophe. The Mechanicus warred with itself over questions that had no answers. The Necrons fractured along ideological lines 60 million years in the making. The Eldar learned to fear stability as much as chaos. Chaos adapted. Tsench abandoned frontal corruption in favor of exploiting the schisms that Tensura's existence had created. Khorne found new fury in those who hated what they could not categorize. Nurgle whispered that stagnation came in many forms, including the stagnation of eternal stability. Slaanesh saw in the Protectorate's emotional flattening a different kind of excess. The galaxy had not been saved. It had simply acquired another contradiction to navigate another impossible choice between survival and principle. And in Warhammer 40,000 contradictions were just another word for Tuesday. Order had come to Nihilus. The price was still being calculated. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.